Now once more I must ride with my knights to defend what was and the dream of what could be.
Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel. Today we're exploring Des Moines, the Tartarian city of the monks. Des Moines, the location of building number 1 for the channel's comparison for all buildings. And here we're not looking at building number 1, we're looking at the Polk County Courthouse. We've explored it before in the video Midwest Palaces. Des Moines has many enigmatic remains of wondrous buildings from the 4th era civilization, such as this building in the downtown. Now, as we conduct this exploration, we're going to find out that Des Moines has had the unfortunate tragedy of losing many of its great buildings. And yet at the same time, some of the most wondrous buildings across the land just happen to be preserved in this one city, such as building number 1, the Iowa State Capitol, the only 5-dome state capitol in the United States. In my humble opinion, there is no other capitol that matches this state capitol. We've been on the inside of it before. It was the first full exploration that the channel conducted, and we saw the unbelievable beauty and detailed ornate decorations within a state capitol in a state that is well known for its corn. And we're going to take a closer look at the account of both the capital and the city of Des Moines. When you look at all the beauty, you can also see that it contains many different materials, and I can assure you, just as I did in that original video, that everything in the state capitol is solid and real. There is no facading, there is nothing here that is cheap, and there is nothing here that was done in a time or budget-saving manner. And keep in mind, we're told that this impressive and beautiful state capitol was built in 1871 to 1886. And you can see gold on the outside of the dome and gold on the inside of the dome, and columns. Let's not forget that it has 29 different types of marble, and you can see some of those marbles expressed here in this banister. You really get the idea of the fact that this is truly a palace. And the reason we had to wait to do our full exploration of Des Moines was we had to look at some of the incredible edifices in places such as the Vatican in Rome, St. Petersburg and Moscow in Russia. And yet here in this state capital in Iowa, we can see the same decorative and detailed ornamentation in this capital that matches the very finest of what we saw when we were looking at St. Petersburg, Moscow, the Vatican, and Prague. And now we see it here. The story of Des Moines. Fort Des Moines founded 1843 and it was abandoned. It was refounded in 1846, flooded in 1851. A school teacher described it as a crappy city. Therefore, in 1857, the state decided to make it the state capital. Look, it's the 19th century. If you can't build a capital city in a place where there is no capital city, it's just not worth doing. Let's take a look at this early bird's eye view map of Des Moines. So this is 1868. And here we have what is the Lincoln Public School, and there is an image of it, and it looks to be the same building. Very intriguing. And then here we have the temporary state capitol. They moved out of that dump in Iowa City in 1857 on the left to the nice building on the right. It was a temporary state capitol until they built the main state capitol, or so we're told. We have this U.S. courthouse and post office, and that would be the same building with a little tower on it. We'll look at that later. And then we have the original county courthouse with a nice dome and pediment on it. And remember, these were all the original ones. We're looking at the bird's eye view. This is supposedly from 1868. We have the Des Moines River that flows north to south, and its link-up point with the Raccoon, which was what the whole point of building Fort Des Moines was. And we have these 4 bridges, and they've always been there. Very interesting, as we're told that the railroad came through Des Moines in 1866 for the first time. Yet, from 1851 until now, they built out this core. There's the Polk County Courthouse, and the current one. And look how well built out this core was. This is only 17 years from the flood. Unbelievable. It kind of reminds me of Atlanta when they essentially built the entire core and main portion of Atlanta in under 20 years. Well, this is Iowa out on what's supposed to be the frontier at the time in 1868, and they'd managed to achieve all of this. Well, let's take a look at where the state capitol would be, our building number 1 in all of our explorations in this very impressive city. And granted, this is just a drawing, it doesn't necessarily prove anything, but here we have the actual block of land where the state capitol sits now and today. Very impressive. And there's the temporary state capitol. And when did they build that? And then we can see these photos, and the one on the left, I wonder if it's modified from the one on the right, but we'll take a closer look at that. And it's as though they just had the block of land designated already, as though the state capitol was already there. But we know that can't be true, right? I mean, look, it assures us. There's the Capitol, and there's Capitol Square, even though it's just an empty patch of land. even though it hadn't been a city that long and they decided to make it the state capital. So again, many anomalies right here, with this original image on the left and then what seems to be an altered image on the right. Well, when we see these early images of Des Moines, we see a very well built out city, and one of my main theories is that Des Moines, or City of the Monks for whatever reason, was one of these enclaves from the Fourth Era civilization, designated to retain knowledge and continue the grand tradition of what that civilization had built. And nowhere is that more obvious in the Iowa State Capitol, built 1871-1886, and I'm calling it Midwest Palace Inception style, not Renaissance Revival. And is this a Fourth Era Region Forum building, or some other incredible palace? We just don't know. This is one of the most impressive structures I've seen in all my explorations on the land. The only state capital that comes close to comparing to this is the one in Connecticut. And here you can see in this aerial footage what the actual tract of land looks like that the state capitol sits on. And there on the left you can see the Soldiers and Sailors Monument, a beautiful column that's right next to the state capitol. We've looked at that and what an anomaly it is, especially with its lovely statue depiction of Iowa, which seemed a little bit inappropriate for the time, but I guess they accepted it, and strangely enough they didn't dedicate it until many decades later. Now here's this image of what Des Moines, Iowa looked like in 1857 on Capitol Moving Day, when they decided to leave that dump that they had in Iowa City. I'm joking, of course. It looks like a very fine capital, and by the way, it's still standing to this day. We will be exploring it when we get to Iowa City. But it's interesting that we have this city that this teacher described as very unfortunate, and here's this early construction photo we have of the state capitol in Iowa, missing the dome, 1871 to 1886. And this is a very strange looking image. It has many problems if you just look at it and analyze it on your own. Now, I'm not going to tell you what those problems are because you've got eyes, you can see it quite well for yourself, and who knows what the reality is with these photos. But then I found this other photo that shows the dome complete. Supposedly, it's supposed to be later than the image we just looked at, but was it really? Or is there something else going on? Is there some sort of image manipulation going on, or is it just as we see it? It's very problematic, especially when we look at accounts for why the good people of Iowa decided to relocate their state capital to a city that hadn't been in existence that long, that had recently been flooded. And here you can see the contrast with some of the furniture here in the governor's office, and what I believe is an early 20th century photo. Compare and contrast that with the woodwork above the doorways, and then the beautiful ornamentation. We're in the Iowa State Capitol right now. And then looking at some of the other images, we have looked at this strange mosaic before, and this is very strange because the mosaic supposedly shows the state capitol with some subsidiary buildings, although we're told it's the older state capitol. And then there's some odd smokestacks in the back of it. But please go back and watch my original exploration on the Iowa State Capitol, and I'll add the link in the description. What I didn't really get to, though, because it was shut down at the time, was the impressive library in the Iowa State Capitol. And here we see many of the beautiful decorations within this library, and why do you need to go to this extent to have such a well-decorated and yet well-protected library? And yes, this is a very well-protected building. It's on top of the hill, and it's also very well built. And yet you can see other contrasts with the stairway with the beautiful marble and some interesting icons depicted in it. Not exactly what we'd expect for a state capital and a state known for its corn. We also have some unbelievable beauty with some of the forum and assembly halls for the state legislature. And then we also have an interesting consideration with the Iowa Supreme Court we'll look at later. Back to the library. So we can see it's multiple levels and there's many different access points to it. And it's as though, once again, no little bit of detail has been spared. You have very well, beautiful decorated pillars with gold at the top. You have decorated banisters and handrails, and all the room for all the books you can possibly imagine. This almost gives you the feeling that you're looking in one of those very impressive monastic libraries over in Europe. And I'm not beginning to wonder if that's exactly what we had going on with Des Moines, because Des Moines means of the monks, and it was supposed to be River Des Moines, and that's why they built Des Moines here, or at least the fort. And oddly enough, the guy who built it wanted to name it Fort Raccoon, but the War Department overruled him. Said, you're going to name it Des Moines. Wonder what kind of works we have of novels and books and recordings and real information. There's also an account that we looked at of a vast underground beneath the Iowa State Capitol. So who knows what works we still have access to in this library, and there's probably a reason why access to it is limited, and oftentimes we can't get full access to it. And of course the works of wonder that are in there. Well, let's go on to the Polk County Courthouse. Now, I call this BABS style, City Beautiful, built 1906, and was this a local forum building? Okay, BA is Beaux Arts, but you know how I feel about Beaux Arts. I just consider it a BS style. We did explore this building in Midwest Palaces when we were looking at all the beautiful courthouses across Iowa, and this is one of the most beautiful. This is the old courthouse and post office, built 1871 and demolished in 1968. It's interesting, though, that when we consider these many buildings that they demolished in the 1960s, why did they have this sudden urban renewal that would hit Des Moines? It never really made a lot of sense. I also failed to mention that in the Iowa State Capitol, they built it right after the Civil War, and then they managed to complete it during the Panic of the 1870s, the worst depression until the Great Depression. The inside of the Polk County Courthouse is very beautiful and ornately decorated as well. Now, this is not very far from the Iowa State Capitol. Indeed, it's just right down the same road across the river from it. Look at some of these decorations. What exactly does this mean? Let me know what you think this figure means in the comments based on some of the other explorations that we've done. This is very impressive and very unique. And it's not something we'd expect to see the good people of Iowa throwing up from 1900 to 1906. And the courthouse has its own little version of a very well decorated and beautiful dome. Certainly not the kind of decorations and efforts that we see put forth with our modern construction techniques of the 21st century, but we have the usual array of reasons why we don't do it. It's too expensive, we have safety standards, we don't have artisans and craftsmen running all over the country. You can also see in this main area in the courthouse the beautiful skylighting, and again, the same decorated handrail. It's an impressive structure that just doesn't seem to add up to what we'd expect to see in Des Moines. And this is one of the other examples, along with the Iowa State Capitol, that you simply can't explain easily away. What the city of Des Moines, the state of Iowa, had all this money after the Civil War, and this is what the official account tells us, that they got a lot of money back, because another interesting tidbit about Iowa, 10% of its entire population contributed to fighting in the Civil War, which is quite impressive. No, not 10% of the male population, 10% of the entire population. And who knows what exactly was going on in the Civil War. But we look in the other interiors of this Polk County Courthouse, and we can see the arched beauty. And we can see that every ceiling, every wall, and we have the pillars in the wall once again, no attention to detail has been spared. City Beautiful, oh of course, and then we've got more columns, and these are complete, looks like one-piece columns that are on the inside of the building. And you'll very rarely see any sort of construction photo showing any column establishment, let alone a column being erected inside a building. Once in a blue moon, you'll get one on the outside of the building, such as the Civil Courts building in St. Louis. Well, this is the criminal courts in Des Moines, and this is kind of what we'd expect to see, a more modern and, I'm not going to say depressing, but perhaps we'll just say not as inspiring as a current building, and I suppose it's appropriate this would be the criminal courts building in Des Moines, Iowa. I don't know, it just gives me a dark feeling just looking at it. I'm not sure why. Well, let's take a look at the Des Moines City Hall, built in 1910, and again, part of the Beaux Arts / BS style, and it was part of the City Beautiful movement. If you don't recall, the City Beautiful movement was supposedly something that swept all the American cities after the World's Fair in Chicago in the 1890s, and this was their response to it. And apparently, the city of Des Moines was just flush with cash in the early 20th century, much like the entire United States was for reasons unknown. I mean, if things are going so well economically, then why did they need to establish a Federal Reserve, and why did they keep having all these so-called economic panics? But I digress, that's always a conflicting account. Another impressive building where they've managed to integrate the columns in the wall, which is always a unique construction style. And here you can see the City Hall with the Iowa State Capitol behind it. This is on the east side of the Des Moines River. Very impressive structures, both of them. And why do I get the feeling that they were built around the same time originally? Although who knows for sure. I mean, if we go off the official history, they didn't need a City Beautiful movement to build the Iowa State Capitol, and that's one of the most beautiful buildings in the land. One of the lamentable aspects, though, with the Des Moines City Hall is that it was renovated and changed quite a bit. Now, I believe this photo is from before that change occurred, so we'll never understand the true interior beauty of this building. Because as always, they're renovating these buildings and changing them from their original beauty that we had when they were established and built. But you can still see there are some remaining details within the City Hall that are quite beautiful and impressive. And we can see some of the decorations above these windows, and even the windows themselves. And to say nothing of the ceiling. I even appreciate the fixtures that all these lights are hanging from. Why don't we do this in our city halls today? I mean, Obviously, we need to make sure that our bureaucrats are focused on their jobs, and we certainly don't want them to be distracted by beautiful ceilings, beautiful windows, and gorgeous vistas that they see when they go into these unique and impressive buildings. And yes, the adjective comes up a lot that you say it's beautiful, but what else can you say? Well, let's compare the Iowa Judicial Branch building. This is postmodern. It's definitely 5th era. It was built in 2003. I actually was present in Des Moines and saw them lift the dome with the mighty sky cranes that they had on top of this building. And I highlight this building for a reason, because this is what they'll try to tell us we do in the 21st century. But as always, when you look inside the building, you can tell there's some glaring inconsistencies, and there's really no comparison when we look at the 3 previous buildings that we did and try to compare it to this Iowa Judicial Courts building. It's where the Iowa Supreme Court meets now. They got kicked out of the Iowa State Capitol. Or, I shouldn't say that. They were relocated here. And looking on the interior, we can see all the wonderful aspects of 21st century architecture. Just feels like it's very cheap and commercial, and they're simply trying to replicate what we could do in the past, supposedly. But of course, we'll be told that's the reason. They couldn't build a beautiful building like the Iowa State Capitol for this building because of safety standards. They didn't have the artisans and craftsmen. They had all. So what they really needed to do was build this very postmodern and monochromatic and monotoned building that on the inside you could see that anybody who's a justice in Iowa would be very depressed walking through. I don't know, it kind of depresses me just looking at it. Why is it we went from the incredible structures of the past to this? Well, we'll be told the usual given reasons. And here you can see in the actual chamber itself for a hearing or proceedings, the ceiling and then the attempts at columns. I mean, they're trying, I'll give them that. And perhaps if we could try to replicate the past, more of our cities would have a welcoming feeling. But to me, this is just evidence that we can achieve what we did in the past. For example, here was where the Iowa Supreme Court met in the Iowa Courthouse before they were relocated. And just looking at this black and white photo, you can see that there's absolutely no comparison with this room in the Iowa State Capitol and what we just looked at in their new judicial court building. Okay, it's kind of bringing me down a little bit, so we're going to move on. Let's go to Terrace Hill, the governor's residence in Iowa, built 1866 to 1869 in the so-called Second Empire style. Now, we have another one of these stories that the first millionaire in Des Moines, obviously it didn't take him long to become a millionaire because the city wasn't even around that long, had arranged to have this house built. And he just didn't have it built by anybody. He, of course, brought in a genius architect from Chicago, someone who was very well involved in Chicago's World's Fair. In fact, it was the same architect who erected or should I say designed, but some people say architects do everything. They design, they build, and then they plan the logistics so they can put up the building. It was the same architect who did the Illinois building who did Terrace Hill. And this has been the governor's residence in Iowa since Governor Day. I believe that was the late 70s, early 1980s, and every governor has resided in here because you couldn't possibly do better than this for a residence, and it's a lovely and incredible old world building that's very stunning inside and out. And here's the Illinois building, and you've probably seen this before from the Chicago World's Fair, and it has this very interesting and narrow dome, which kind of reminds me of the Connecticut State Capitol, which is the only state capitol, in my opinion, that compares with the Iowa State Capitol, although it's not 5-domed. This one's 1-domed, and it looks like 2 or 4 bells. And then also designed this building in Chicago that kind of reminds me of the Smithsonian Castle. I'm sure that's just yet another coincidence. But very impressive, along with the tower and the subsidiary towers, and then there's subsidiary towers on the main tower, so just can't get enough towers on that. Back to Terrace Hill, it has a nice little pool by it, and it looks like there was an older structure in and around it, so what exactly is that all about? And how old is this pool? For some reason, when we look at Terrace Hill, even though they tell us it's Second Empire style, we get the feeling that we're actually back in Rome. And maybe we're going to see Licinius Crassus come over the hill and walk and dive in the pool. Here's an older photo from it, and you can see how it used to be decorated. Now, there's apparently been a lot of back and forth about the actual use of the pool. I mean, why wouldn't the governor of Iowa want to go in there and take a dive at the end of every day? I know I would. Imagine if it was Arnold Schwarzenegger. No, I don't like Iowa. I only go to the magical land of California. I stay away from Cornland. So you look at the interior and you can see that there's some unique intricacies on the inside of this wondrous edifice. And again, some fine geometry in both the walls and the ceiling. And remember, this is just built as a residence. And of course, the explanation given is that it was built for the city's first millionaire, and he brought the architect in from Chicago. So anything's possible. Don't let logistical limitations get in the way of building your dream home. And it begs the question, why exactly would someone who was so wealthy and so well off in the 19th century want to go out to the frontier where there's a lot of hardships? Because there was more opportunities? Because it was cheaper? It just doesn't make any sense, and yet it's a story we see repeated all the time. Look at this impressive window on the stairway and banister. And then here again, you can see the detailing in the walls and the ceiling, and painting and decorations, and even look at the fine detail on the pillars and the archway here. And this is just supposed to be a residence? This is just supposed to be somebody's house. I mean, really, why would you come out to Iowa? You could have just stayed in Chicago, and this would have been a lot easier. We've seen great mansions in Chicago. Nope, I'm going out to Des Moines to make my fortune. The city flooded just a few years ago, and it should be noted that Des Moines has experienced many floods since then. Most recently, probably the worst one was in 1993, and then there was another one in the 2000s. So, overruns the Saylorville Reservoir, which is just north of the city. Look at some of the impressive banisters and just the layout of this unique house. Second Empire style? I mean, nothing on the inside looks remotely Empire style to me, but of course the actual adjudication of what the styles are is left to the expert architects, who are experts in everything. They just don't build like this for a variety of reasons now. And we'll be told it's because the will of the people does not indicate that they want any kind of structures like this built. Well, the governor of Iowa seems to have themselves a really nice residence, whether it's Kim Reynolds, Terry Branstad, or any of the other names that have filled this office since Robert Day. And here we have the State Historical Building. And isn't this very intriguing? And this is an older photo that shows us that this building's been with us for a while. And this seems to be the building that they were trying to, how shall we say, emulate when they built the building for the Iowa Supreme Court. And yet there's some subtle differences that we can see, such as the pediments above the window, and isn't that an interesting eagle up there? Where have we seen that before? Is it an eagle or is it something else? Let me know in the comments. And now we see East High School. We're going to look at a couple different high schools because in Iowa we have these high schools where it seems as though they have a very particular design to them, where they have a pediment and then 4 columns, and that seems to be the go-to design for many different high schools. And the question I'm going to ask is, why? Why do you need to have a pediment and columns for many different high schools? This is the Grotto of the Redemption, and this is the largest grotto in the world. Now, this isn't located in Des Moines. This is in an isolated area in Iowa, but I just thought I would show this as a little bit of a break from the exploration to let you know that there are other anomalies in Iowa. We've got the largest grotto in the world, originally the largest dam, and also the largest viaduct on a 2-way railway in the early 20th century. All that on top of the most impressive and only 5-dome state capitol in the United States. All in Iowa, an agrarian state. An agrarian state whose population for the longest time was only around 2 million. And of course, looking at the population growth of Iowa in the 19th century is of course problematic. We'll be told, oh, it was all immigration and there was no problem. Very interesting though when you look at these older photos of the Iowa State Capitol and you can see some of the residences that were apparently within proximity of it. Well, most of those residences have been demolished since then, in conjunction with the downtown of Des Moines, Iowa. And here's the picture of the downtown around the courthouse that we're told was built in 1906, although who knows the truth behind the courthouse. There's some interesting aspects to this image. And what exactly was present in Des Moines? Well, we constantly have clues and indications that there was a lot more present in the past than there is in the present. And that's from several of the images we have. This is the original photo of Lincoln High School, undoubtedly the first public school if we compare and contrast the bird's eye view from 1868 in Des Moines. Now remember, a bird's eye view doesn't necessarily prove anything because it's merely a drawing at the time, a rendering, but it does give us an idea that they already had this city planned out. And remember, it was only 17 years after the flood when they essentially restarted or reset the city again. Here's the current Abraham Lincoln High School. And very impressive structure in and of itself. Again, we see pediments and decorations above the window. We see some very interesting little tower structures. And what exactly is that symbol in that circle all about? Let me know in the comments. Now, we're going to go back and do an exploration just considering a lot of the symbolism, not to be confused with symbology, that we see across the land with many of these great structures. Here's a more modern picture of the Abraham Lincoln High School in Des Moines. And you can see that it's holding up very nicely. you can see, oh, we've also had those symbols that we tend to see around the orb structures. And then we've got some spheres up top and then that strange symbol in the circle again. Here's some older imagery from Des Moines that we're supposedly looking at that's either from the late 19th, early 20th century. And these bricks look like they've been there for quite some time. And I always find the brick walkways and streets and sidewalks and everything else very interesting, because it gives the impression that there was a lot more infrastructure present in the city. But then you look at this other image and it looks like the road is covered with complete mud as we look down the way here at the state capitol. This is where we tend to see these conflicting and contrasting accounts. We have the official written accounts of what was going on, but the images don't always seem to match up to them. What's your explanation for this? Well, here we go to Old Main and Drake University. This is the main administration building. We're told this was built in the 1880s. And why is it they always call these buildings Old Main? Well, it was the Old Main Administration Building. It was just a term that everybody used in the 19th century. And you go to any and every university, and that's what it's known for. Drake University is rather interesting with the four major universities in Iowa, and the fact that it's in Des Moines. And you look at the Old Main and you can see that there's many unique aspects to its architecture, at least something that we'd not expect to see in some colleges, and yet we have seen it in many colleges with the Old Main building. It's also impressive that their original Old Main building is standing, because we know that's not the case with many other universities. Very unique though, with some of the layout, including the main entryway, and looking at the complex precision and arrangement of the blocks and the building bricks, if that's indeed what it is. I need to get on site and take a look at this. Although, I will admit, Drake University has not exactly ever crossed my list of visiting, and you all well know that I've been in Des Moines many times for on-site explorations. So I guess I'm just going to have to add Drake University to the list, because despite my best efforts, I found some challenges finding some interior photos of this old main building. And I'm wondering exactly how it's been altered over the years. And so now you can probably guess I obviously never taught at Drake University. Still, there's some other buildings and impressive aspects to it, and we are going to be doing an exploration where we look at some of the impressive universities, not just in the United States, but other universities across the land, because there never seem to be any shortage of, how should we say, very unique and impressive buildings wherever we go, whether we're in the United States or Germany, the United Kingdom, or even in Iraq. Going back to these high schools, you can see that there's a pediment here and the four-column design. Now, could these buildings have had a different function originally? Because this seems to be a primary go-to design type that we would consider neoclassical, or as they say, depending on the building, Renaissance Revival. So this high school is located in Waterloo, which is a city that's about a 2-hour drive from Des Moines, and I want to highlight this to show that this particular style of high school just seems to have persevered across the land. And again, I'm wondering if this was some other original type of function for these buildings. Were these some sort of forums? And we have to wonder, what's the origin of the term forum? Because there's too many examples of these types of high schools with this advanced construction. Some not only have the columns out in front under the pediment on the main entryway, but they also have the columns that are integrated into the walls. So very intriguing that there are so many examples of these so-called high schools that have these architectural intricacies in them. Why wouldn't they have built more modest high schools at the time? This is the remnants of Fort Madison, and this is another on-site exploration I'm going to be doing. Now, this is over in the Mississippi area of Iowa, and the reason I'm highlighting some of the other anomalies in Iowa as part of the Des Moines exploration is there's just something very unique about this overall state and this portion of the land. Even though we're told that it's flyover country, we shouldn't pay any attention to it. There's nothing unique here about Abraham Lincoln School. There's nothing really to see about it. Yes, they have some very impressive architectural detailings, but you need that to have an effective high school. Iowa took their education seriously, and you could only seriously educate students if you had the very finest buildings to do so in. Of course, they don't seem to have retained that to now, but things have changed. Such as Highland Park College. Here we have our postcard of Highland Park College, and this compound is very intriguing because we think of all the other university or colleges that we see across the land, and yet we have to ask ourselves, is this representing something else? Because if we go back to the concept that something about Des Moines, or the original city from the 4th era, made it special, then perhaps there was something that was intentionally preserved here. Because what we see when we look at the older images of Des Moines, whether it's the city core, the colleges, the municipal buildings, or even the state capitol, we get the impression that for whatever reason, this area was spared the effects of the reset, because it seems to have been completely intact. Now, there is a little bit of a tragedy that accompanies it because once the so-called City Beautiful movement ended in the 20th century, when we got to the mid-20th century, Des Moines was unfortunately afflicted by that urban renewal movement. Of course, they have their usual explanations in the economics at the time. And here in this Veterans Hospital, once again we see the same layout that we saw in the high schools with the pediment and the 4 columns, all over Iowa, so not just high schools. And this is what a lot of people expect to see when they think of Iowa. Open farmland, some trees, some hills, although a lot more flat than this, but there are actually a lot of hilly areas in Iowa. And then you can look in some of the older postcards and you can see that there were many more buildings when you look at the old city core of Des Moines. And we're going to look at 2 images in a second that were very difficult to come by. And we're going to look at the Victoria Hotel now, built in 1899. I say 3 question marks because, you can always question it. And destroyed, not demolished, in 1962. How could they destroy a building like this? A very incredible and remarkable hotel. And we don't really have much in terms of records for what the interior of it looked like. But why would anybody want to get rid of something like this? All we really have is this brochure and some posters that give us some clue in terms of what the interior looked like. The Victoria Motel in Des Moines, and this is one of the famous railway hotels, and they even tell us that it's an exclusively European plan. But we get some hint of what the interior was like, although this is really just more of a drawing, so does this really prove anything? No, but it does give us some hints. Some people might argue, well, it's a drawing that's based on a photograph. I'm not really sure. Maybe it's a photograph, maybe it's a drawing. That's always the hard thing to tell. But what kind of opulence and decorative detail did you have in this once great impressive hotel that graced the skyline of Des Moines? And there were many edifices that graced the city core of Des Moines. And if you ask any resident of Des Moines who's been around and understands the history of the city, they'll confirm, even the mainstream, that the city core was devastated. Now, I couldn't verify if this was the actual entryway or lobby of the Victoria Hotel, but we see a radiator there and it may be. Yes, this is the kind of hotel and the kind of apartment building that you'll have in Des Moines. For the low, low price of $2,100 a month, one of these nice little individual units could be yours. Or for the low, low price of $450,000, this nice postmodern home can be yours. Just so I compare and contrast that. Ah, there we go, the Victoria Hotel. So you can see there's really no comparison of what we try to say is modern from what we used to have in the past. It's a clear and decisive degradation in capability. Now, let's take a look at the Des Moines aerials from 1957. This is where we see perhaps one of the greatest tragedies of Des Moines. Many of these wondrous buildings, and these were not brutalist architecture buildings, when you look a little bit more closer, you can see that a lot of these were old world buildings. Many of these were unfortunately torn down in the 1960s, to include the aforementioned Victoria Hotel. And when you look a little closer, you get an idea of the tragedy. Even mainstream defenders of the account will admit that the core of Des Moines was decimated. That's the terminology that they use. And many of these very impressive structures were torn down. And in fact, when you go to the core of Des Moines now, around the Polk County Courthouse, you'll notice that it seems a little barren. Especially when you compare and contrast these aerial photos from the 1950s, even to the opening imagery that we had when we started. Here's another one. And when you look at some of these buildings, such as this one here, look at this dome. And some of the impressive designs that went into this building. And I'm always up to the question in terms of what the actual construction material was from the Iowa State Capitol to all these buildings. Were these some sort of advanced geopolymer, some sort of concrete that matched Roman concrete, or even some material that we do not fully understand? Indeed, I remember going to the Polk County Courthouse in the Midwest Palaces exploration and pondering exactly what that was made out of, because there's something about that material, including the material of the Iowa State Capitol, that does not seem like a material that we would ever produce today or be capable of producing back in the early 20th century. Now from the 1950s, let's go back to 1906 and look at this panorama of Des Moines. Look at that impressive building there to the left. This is the very start of the 20th century. And when you look at this panorama and we're looking east, you can see there were many more buildings in the early 20th century. There's the state capitol, building number 1, the great palace of the Iowa State Capitol, and yet all these other impressive buildings in Des Moines. This picture right here, this panorama, really shows how much was lost over the years. And the aerial photos from the 1950s shows how much was lost. I think that's some of the greatest evidence that we have of what remained of the Fourth Era in Des Moines, Iowa. So thank you for joining me.